Every car manufacturing country tends to have a hub around which its automotive industry develops. These hubs, in turn, tend to be pre-established industrial powerhouses. It comes as no surprise that Detroit became famous as Motown when one looks at the vast iron and steel industry that once thrived on the shores of the Great Lakes. Likewise, Mercedes, Porsche, Opel and Ford Germany all established themselves on the Rhine, and as previously discussed in other videos, the UK is no different, with many of its major manufacturers being found amongst the foundries and forges in the West Midlands. Rather than simply tell you that and expect you to believe me wholesale, which you should be doing anyway, I decided to, rather than spend hours of my precious time trying to raise a level of conception of this video any other way in a desperate attempt to prove myself as an artiste, while grappling with the insecurity that the niche of YouTube car history edutainment may never allow me to achieve that, or the further insecurity that it is possible and I am simply incapable of it, I decided to make this fucking map.
Mapman.
As you'd be able to see if you alt-tabbed back to this video from whichever RTS/simulator game you're currently playing, there are some notable exceptions to the West Midlands principle, but the general trend is towards Coventry and Birmingham. But today, we talk about a company that's a bit further north. A little company called Jowett, the only mass manufacturer to hail from God's own country. That's right, get your pints of Tim Taylor's and Old Peculiar. We're going to Yorkshire! Jowett was a small but determined little operation that dated far further back than most car videos are willing to cover, something I myself am guilty of. I'm talking about the kind of time period where you just generally point and say, they're really old, before jumping forward to the interesting stuff. But not today! Where cars exist, there is shit to talk about, so sit down, shut up, and learn about the thing you claim to be an enthusiast of. The background of Benjamin and William Jowett genuinely reads like an excerpt from the middle of the Four Yorkshiremen sketch. The sons of a small engineering shop owner, their interest in mechanics was fostered from an early age. Unfortunately, said father suffered from a chronic foot infection, and to distract himself from the pain, turned to alcohol and various forms of abuse as a pastime. As the relationship with their father deteriorated, Ben and Bill, along with their sister Ruth, moved into a new house half a mile down the road, and in 1901 started their own engineering firm with naught but 90 quid between them. Ruth quickly sold her third of the business to Arthur Lamb, a professional engineer who, unlike the Jowett brothers, had the patience for bookkeeping. They quickly found their way into making their own motorcycles. Once again, in this early period, motorbikes were little more than just that, bicycles with motors attached. As most people with an engineering shop were trying their hand at exactly that, this wasn't all that impressive in itself. The important part was, even at this early stage, they were making their own engine. By 1904, the company rechristened itself as the Jowett Motor Manufacturing Company, and 2 years later, it would produce its first prototype car. Bill, Ben and Arthur put together their first car 2 years before the Model T entered production, and they did so not backed by the state-of-the-art productive might of the Great Lakes State, but out of a little workshop on Burlington Street in Bradford, right next to the Valley Parade. Back in day, Bradford was surrounded by coal mines that were used in turn to power its significant industry, which primarily consisted of textile manufacturing. One might ask why Yorkshire's own car manufacturer emerged there rather than amongst the iron and steel industries of Leeds or Sheffield, but when one remembers that Coventry itself had a thriving textile industry before foreign competition forced local businesses to experiment, it suddenly makes a lot more sense. Meanwhile, back in the 1900s, Jowett's first prototype did not mark an immediate transition of business. In fact, the shop was so busy that it would take until 1910, 4 years after the prototype was first put together, for it to make it to production. During this time, it was experimented with and refined, and the result was the Jowett 6 horsepower, an economy vehicle even by the standards of the time, featuring seating only for 2. However, even at this early stage, hallmarks of Jowett design were established, namely the boxer engine layout, which Jowett would not deviate from for its entire life. Here it took the form of a dinky little 816cc flat twin. In these early days, the pursuit of smoothness was the primary concern of many automakers. Jowett had begun building their reputation for this with an earlier V-twin, although later experiments had found that the opposing motion of a boxer nearly perfectly cancelled out vibration. As a result, Jowetts were more often than not much smoother running than their contemporaries. Jowett were able to produce just 48 cars before forced Jowett to turn their attention away from automobiles and towards munitions. After the war to end all wars ended all wars and there was never another war ever again, work began on a small factory a few miles up the road at Idle. I always do this bit in my videos where I show where the old factory was as a shitty bit of foreshadowing. I wonder what's actually here.
What the fuck? What the... No. What? Huh?
When it began operations in 1919, it was producing the new Jowett 7 horsepower, following an engine increase to a whopping 907 cc's.
No replacement for displacement! USA! USA!
The 7 horsepower was far more successful, with over 11,000 produced in short and longer wheelbase forms from 1919 to 1936. These were the first mass production cars Jowett built, and their solid build quality and low gearing built for the rolling Yorkshire Dales earned them a local reputation for dependable motoring at a good price. This still marked Jowett out as a decidedly small operation though. That's less than 1,000 cars a year on average, while the Jowett 7's main competitor, the Austin 7, sold 2,500 in its first year alone, and that was considered a disappointment before it really hit the algorithm. What is interesting to note is that Jowett arguably beat Austin to the punch with the big car in miniature idea.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived.
Both were budget, entry-level vehicles that offered their drivers a much more car-like experience compared to the bare minimum cycle cars that had thus far populated the bottom of the four-wheeled vehicle market. Austin popularized this concept and rightfully has a place in the history books because of it, but Jowett began production of their big car in miniature 4 years before Austin. Another of Jowett's distinguishing characteristics is illustrated here. Despite their small size, they were a shockingly innovative company. For example, all Jowetts featured extensive use of aluminium in their powertrains rather than heavy cast iron, a huge leap forward for an economy car in the early 20th century, considering aluminium engines were still almost exclusively seen in sports and supercars until the 60s. In 1936, the 7 was replaced with the updated 8 and 10, the latter of which had grown to a mind-melting 1.2 litres in a Boxer 4 configuration. Unfortunately, Jowett only managed to produce a small handful of these cars before once again forced a diversion of attention. But Jowett knew that the people would want a fresh start post-World War II. Perhaps they could sense the transformations coming. Advances in technology and changes in political structure would forever alter the way we lived our lives. Ships could carry more and go further, deepening existing trade routes and opening new ones previously inconceivable to processions of freighters. Ocean liners were faster and cheaper than ever, connecting the new world to the old, although many predicted that in a few years these faster journey times would be rendered obsolete by the increasing market for air travel. All of this isn't even to mention the oncoming obsession with the atom, the miracle tech that it promised, and the cultural fixation of futurism it fed into. More so than ever, the future whatever that meant, was just around the corner and chased with enthusiastic abandon. The world was becoming more connected, more international, and progress was being made at a breakneck pace. Jowett, forward-thinking as it was, knew that in order to survive as a small company, they needed to get a head start on this curve. All they had to do was produce a revolutionary, era-defining car.
You're goddamn right.
Unfortunately, that project was going to take time and money, so in the meantime, they started churning out these. The Jowett Bradford van was based on the pre-war Jowett 8 and was the perfect little commercial errand runner for the growing environment of the metropolitan city. An undersquare side-valve 1-litre flat twin ensured adequate puff for the little runabout, as long as you never needed to go much faster than 50. In a post-Blitz Britain, the Bradford was exactly the kind of cheap, light utility vehicle that was needed to aid the slow rebuild and return to business as usual. As such, Jowett sold thousands of the little buggers. The Bradford doing numbers was the boost Jowett needed to go ahead with its plans to truly take on the world. In July of 1946, at an event celebrating the 60th anniversary of UK car production, Jowett unveiled the Javelin. The Javelin was an extremely advanced car for immediately post-war Europe. Its aerodynamic body with faired-in headlights and curved one-piece windscreen set at an angle that wasn't near vertical gave it a strikingly modern appearance in line with the American trendsetters that war-torn Europeans would quickly begin to aspire to. These streamlined curves formed part of a primitive unibody featuring a very stiff box section frame that was welded into it. Torsion bars were employed front and rear, giving
a well-balanced, straight level ride even on bumpy roads.
That's not the ad speaking, that's the Chrysler Corporation who bought one for testing. The American automobile Goliath summed up the plucky Yorkshire car as
the first especially interesting post-war British car to be produced.
Indeed, Chrysler was such a fan of the torsion bars that the unique hexagon-ended design Jowett employed would mysteriously appear on Chrysler's own not long after. Powering the Javelin was an all-new overhead valve 1.5-litre flat 4 mounted right up at the car's nose. The radiator was actually mounted above and behind the engine. There was method to this mad choice. The engine was so low that cool air could easily make its way to the radiator, while the engine being mounted so far forward allowed for much greater space in the passenger compartment. An idiosyncrasy that made slightly less sense was the combining of a split aluminium block with cast iron heads. Still, this meant the 4-pot boxer was smooth, refined, and light. In fact, the entire car came in at just 962 kilos. Impressive for a well-equipped car that could seat up to 6 1940s-sized people. Combined with the little terrier of an engine, truth was given to the typically Yorkshire loudmouth slogan, "Take a good look as it passes you." At launch, the press lauded the Javelin for its advanced features. A 1949 road report from the Times noted its brisk performance and easy-to-operate controls, making it a restful car to drive. Looking at the competition it faced from the home islands when it first launched, it's easy to see why. The Javelin represents one of the first major breaks from pre-war motoring in Britain. Competition from Austin, Morris, MG, Wolseley, Riley, Jaguar, Singer, and Sunbeam Talbot all clearly belied their pre-war roots. Even competitors from the continent struggled to keep up. Only some of the most advanced cars of the pre-war era, like the Citroën Traction Avant and the Lancia Aprilia, really held a candle to the Jowett, as it was these cars that designer Gerald Palmer had pin-ups of in his room. Palmer had been poached from the Nuffield organisation during the war, but not before he had designed the Oxford Vaporizer! I'm not going to tell you what that is or what it was for, I just want you to envision whatever you think the Oxford Vaporizer is. Palmer was encouraged to specify all the advanced features he wanted for the Javelin, and the result was the UK's first distinctly post-war car ready for the new era. Intended as a world car to be sold into markets around the globe, Javelins found their way to every corner of the Commonwealth, including some limited complete knockdown kit assembly in Melbourne later on in its life. Perhaps it was always destined to have a life down under, as the entirety of the car's assembly at idle took place upside down before being spun around in a special jig, fitted with wheels and rolled out the door. The sprightly little 1.5 boxer, lightweight and stiff chassis also lent the car surprisingly well to motorsport. A Javelin won its class at the 1949 Monte Carlo Rally, the first one held since the end of the war. while another won the 2-litre touring class at the 24 Hours of Spa. A Javelin also won its class in the 1952 International RAC Rally, and a year later the overall winner of the grueling Tulip Rally was a privately entered Javelin. Jowett, it seemed, had keen heads for eking speed from little engines. This was of course the MO of the British sports car, a format then being pioneered by the MGT type. In the ration-restricted economy of 1940s Britain, the mantra was export or die, and these MGs were selling like hotcakes in America. Jowett realised that if they could get a slice of the same pie, they make an absolute killing. But they were going to do it proper. After the war, one Dr. Robert Abraham von Eberhorst was somehow encouraged away from his position at Porsche to take up a position at ERA. Eberhorst was a heavy-hitter engineer, a colleague of Ferdinand Porsche, and designer of the ludicrous Auto Union Type D Grand Prix racer that had won the last European Drivers' Championship before the war. It was this verifiable automotive mad scientist that Jowett turned to design their plucky little sports car. And he agreed. The result was the Jowett Jupiter, a neat little 2-seat sports car complete with a tuned version of the Javelin engine and an aluminium body atop the Eberhorst tubular frame chassis. The nimble little Jupiter followed in the sporting footsteps of its stablemate, finishing first and second in its class at the 1951 Monte Carlo Rally and an outright win at the 1951 Lisbon Rally. But most impressive of all, the Jowett Jupiter won its class in Le Mans 3 years in a row from 1950 to 1952. In the final year, a massively modified variant called the Jupiter R1 was the car that took the title. This racing spec machine featured a more aggressive cam, racing carbs, a higher compression ratio, and a reinforced version of Eberhorst's chassis featuring a stressed bulkhead. None of that is what makes the R1 cool though. That would be the exposed cylinder heads poking out of the body. This thing is a Mad Max flavored go-kart and I love it. All this industry-smashing modernity from a tiny little Bradford company is absolutely shocking, and one would have been forgiven for thinking that Yorkshire had produced a success story that was rocketing to the big leagues. However, under the bonnet, all was not well in Idle. The Javelin was a massively ambitious car that took Jowett a very long time to make. Work had begun on it in 1944, and even after its summer 1946 unveiling, production wouldn't start until late 1947. On top of this, while Jowett had the know-how to develop Britain's first new post-war car, manufacturing it was a completely different ballgame. Many of the car's major components were not made by Jowett and contracted out to various engineering firms. The advanced pressed steel unibody was manufactured by Briggs at their Doncaster works, the gearbox was made by Meadows, the engine's rotating assembly by Salisbury. The result of each of these contractors requiring payment for their work was a car that was deemed too expensive for the first upmarket offering from Jowett's previously budget model range. This mattered not, fortunately. The Javelin was still priced competitively at launch, and its modernity gave it instant popularity. Thousands of orders were coming in, and initially Jowett was selling them faster than they could make them. This may seem like a happy problem to have, but it meant the effective cost of manufacture was even higher. Then there was a decision to diversify into the sports car market. This spread Jowett's engineering and development team thin, and as a result, mistakes were made. Eberhorst had only set out the initial design and concept for the chassis, and when doing so was of the understanding that it would be for a hardtop sports car. When he passed on the project to others, this was not communicated, and so Jowett had to do some last-minute adjustments to the chassis for the standard roadster body to be stiff enough. This amounted to welding extra steel to the chassis, drastically increasing weight. The Jupiter ended up only 102 kilos lighter than the Javelin, when in theory, with its tubular chassis and aluminium body, it should have been much lighter. Furthermore, the Jupiter suffered more greatly than the Javelin from Jowett's cost of production woes. One could spend just £180 more and get a Jaguar XK120, the world's fastest production car. While this does mostly speak to the outrageous bang for buck one got for buying Jaguar at the time, it nonetheless indicates a major problem. In conjunction with Jowett's inability to crack the US market, it meant the Jupiter sold only around 900 units in its lifetime. Beyond that, some Jowett owners began complaining of crankshaft failures. How could a fault as deep and critical as this have not been discovered during testing? Back in the day, the general consensus was if a component like a crankshaft could survive 10 million revolutions at engine speed, it was good to go. In development, the Flat 4 had passed this benchmark with flying colours. In tests conducted to get to the bottom of the issue, an engine was disassembled after 250 hours at 4,200 RPM, close to the engine's peak power output, and the crankshaft was found to be faultless. After the engine was reassembled and tests continued, the crankshaft cracked and failed after just another 7 hours. Even worse, the causes differed and varied in their consistency, and so a fix couldn't be found and agreed upon. Communicating with external firms to help them fix the issue was inefficient and wasted precious time, while Jowett didn't have the facilities or resources to solve the issue themselves. Worse still, by the beginning of the 50s, the rest of the industry had caught up. Morris, Wolseley, Austin, Lanchester and Singer had all replaced the cars the Javelin competed against with brand new models that each wore away at its novel coat of modernity. Jowett had to reduce the cost of manufacture in order to remain competitive, while developing replacements for its existing model range. An extremely tall order for such a small company. Work began first on a replacement for the Bradford, internally called the CD type. This new car was to be more consumer-oriented, although commercial variants were still prioritized. A new modern body was designed in cooperation with Briggs, and up to 3 engine options were to be made available. An upgraded version of the flat twin, increased to 1.1 litres and featuring an inlet-over-exhaust valve train rather than side valves, the flat 4 from the Javelin, and potentially a 3-cylinder Perkins P3 diesel to be offered in commercial versions only. Saloon, estate and van versions were all built and tested, including a ute version specifically intended for the Australian market. Intended for a 1952/53 launch, the CD type aimed to offer a solution to those put off by the Javelin's increasing price. Then came the Jupiter's successor. Despite being the newest car in the range, it was in dire need of a fresh start, with plans for a very different Mark II version being proposed just 2 years after its 1950 launch. This intent coalesced in the Jupiter R4, a radically different car from the original. The R4 featured a heavily modified chassis with a wheelbase several inches shorter, a new reinforced plastic body that could be produced in-house and help bring the weight down to a very competitive 711 kilos, and a tuned version of the Jupiter's engine with a revised camshaft. Announced at the 1953 Earl's Court Motor Show, it drew immediate attention for the bold claim that it was
the cheapest 100-mile-an-hour car on the market.
Indeed, the claimed price of just over £773 not only made it some £300 cheaper than the existing Jupiter, but cheaper than the Javelin too. How realistic that price was is up for debate, but the other factor of the claim was technically the truth. The car could outpace its predecessor and touch triple-digit speeds, as long as a skinny geezer was driving and the windscreen removed. Finally, the rarely alluded to CE type was to replace the groundbreaking Javelin. Very little is known about this vehicle, other than a few sketches showing the design evolution from the Javelin to the proposed consumer version, that a commercial variant was planned, and that a new flat 4 was to power it, retaining the old engine's 90mm stroke and upping the bore to match that of the stroke. This would result in an engine of 2.3 litres and similarly move this new car further up market. Imagine, if you can, a Yorkshire Lancia Aurelia. Additionally, this new engine was proposed for a future Jupiter. These vehicles had promise, and had Jowett played their cards correctly and other parties played theirs worse, we may have seen more than just a handful of pre-production vehicles we have today. Of course, that's not how the game went. The CD type suffered terrible delays getting to production. Briggs were incredibly busy and not in the best financial health, so procuring their cooperation for the new vehicle was proving difficult. The new flat twin running too rough was also causing problems, and was why the Javelin's flat 4 was suggested to be made available. To keep ticking over, Jowett knew they needed to bring more of the production of components in-house to reduce costs, but that was a lot easier said than done. The Javelin's body was out of the question, being far too complicated and requiring massive upfront investment for the facilities, as did the casting equipment needed for the rotating assembly. Ultimately, in 1951, it was decided that Jowett would terminate its contract with Meadows and begin constructing the gearboxes themselves. By 1952, the so-called J-box was implemented en masse. This went terribly. Not nearly enough time was spent by the already overstretched engineering department setting up the production line. Second-hand sellers started listing the Meadows gearbox as a selling point. Combined with the crankshaft issues, output of finished cars slowed to a crawl, and body shells from Briggs piled up in the factory yard waiting to be turned into cars. Incredibly though, the engineering department were able to quickly diagnose the issues and set to work fixing them. The J-box was introduced around car number 18,000, and it was these cars that suffered the most. But out of the batch between 21,000 and 22,000, only 8 gearbox claims were made by owners, and after that, none more so than usual. Things were tough for the little company, but with the backing of shareholders, it looked like it could weather the storm and at least pull through until the next generation of vehicles. But then, Jowett was reminded that the other players had no interest in their underdog story. By the 50s, large automobile conglomerates were beginning to grow tired of the arrangement they had with body pressing companies. The economies of scale simply didn't make any sense, and there was a serious profit to be made in the simultaneous vertical and horizontal integration. Briggs, an American company, were beginning to feel the heat of the Big Three, and to keep themselves solvent, decided to sell off their unnecessary assets abroad. Their primary UK operation was in Dagenham, literally across the street from Ford's main UK factory. After acquiring Briggs UK, Ford gave Jowett a year to find a different supplier. Even worse, they deemed the Doncaster factory surplus to requirement and looked to sell it. Fortunately, independent bodybuilder Fisher & Ludlow bought the factory, representing a non-competitive third party with which Jowett could negotiate. Fisher & Ludlow were then immediately bought by BMC, the titanic amalgamation of Austin and the Nuffield organisation, who similarly were not interested in doing business with a direct, if small, rival like Jowett. This was a blow the engineering team couldn't Wallace and Gromit their way out of. The days of the independent steel pressing firm were coming to a close. After Fisher & Ludlow were acquired by BMC, basically the only firm left in the business was the Press Steel Company, whose closest facility was 180 miles away. Meanwhile, Jowett simply didn't have the means to take on the burden of making their own bodies. The factory site at Idle was small, and while there were plenty of funds to continue operating, there wasn't nearly enough to set up the facilities required for steel pressing. Alternatives like reinforced plastic work for sports cars like the Jupiter, and may even have been suited to economy cars like the CD type, but on a premium car like the proposed CE type, plastic wasn't going to cut it. Though they weren't yet bleeding out, Jowett could tell they'd been backed into a corner in a fight they couldn't win. So rather than painfully draw out their inevitable death, Jowett decided to go out on their own terms. In July of 1954, 50 years after the refounding of the Jowett Motor Manufacturing Company, after over 38,000 Bradfords, 23,000 Javelins, and 900 Jupiters had been made, Jowett announced it would sell its factory to International Harvester, and later that year begin voluntarily foreclosing the company. Doing so allowed Jowett not only to avoid bankruptcy, but also pay its shareholders the nominal value of their shares. Tears were shed, and a great loss suffered. But responsible management made sure that the end came about as well as it could have. With that bittersweet wink and smile, Jowett tipped its cap and marched into that good night. I often wax lyrical about what could have been in these videos. The sad thing is, though, in the case of Jowett, there is no other outcome. There is a chance they could have kept going if they downscaled operations and focused solely on the R4 Jupiter, but that doesn't represent a survival in my book. If we go back further, maybe they survive if they save the Jupiter for later and focus their efforts entirely on the Javelin. The unfortunate truth is, Jowett, and the car manufacturing legacy of Yorkshire along with it, was destined to come to an end. I'd been to Bradford a few times before, but only as a child. My only experiences connected to the city was my first time playing what I would later learn was an N64 at the Media Museum, my first demonstration of how a live green screen worked at the Media Museum. There was also a car show I'd been to that took place just outside the Media Museum. Of the handful of times I had visited the city, it was for some kind of exhibit, something that had been put on. And once their novelty had worn out for the day, my parents whisked me away, having no interest in staying a second longer. Despite having 2 decades to my name, they still seemed worried that I was going to the city and warned me to be careful. The plan for the YouTube Funny was set out as so, in simple steps. Arrive at Shipley Station. Leave the station via the northwest exit, oblivious to the existence of the northeast exit. Walk east down Leeds Road, taunted by the existence of the northeast exit, to the Carnegie Drive bus stop. Wait for either the 6:12, 6:13, or 6:14 bus. Realise the bus is late, and wander into the prefab Control-V Mackeys for a piss. Exit the Mackeys, and miss the bus. Sprint after the bus for 2 bus stops, resulting in the partial failure of respiratory and motor functions. Give up and wait at the Roseboro Road stop for the next bus. Thus far, the plan had been executed with military precision. I cozied up, removing my jacket in order to create a protective hovel dangling high above any reasonably comfortable sitting position on the anti-homeless bench. It was then that I was challenged. Across the road at the Texaco, a road warrior atop a small red dirt bike. He was head to toe in black, a balaclava revealing naught but the windows to his soul. I was too far away and astigmatism afflicted to peer into them, though I didn't need to do so to tell that our walks of life were very different, as he left the safe habitat beneath a sheltering Texaco roof and coaxed the poor little machine into a steep wheelie, in the process revealing to me that his abused steed lacked number plates. He returned to his home base and repeated this ritual at least once. I thought of pulling out my phone and documenting him, though out of fear I did not. His obscuring choice of fashion deliberately created an unknown quantity, anywhere from downtrodden self-righteous kid to hardened criminal, though I heavily leant towards the former when aggravated, say by someone across the street with a pointed phone. Either can be equally dangerous. Eventually, some words were exchanged between him and a woman, both took their leave, and I was able to return to the plan, of which very little remained. After being betrayed by my debit card and resorting to a virtual card I had for just such situations, I was on the way to the Morrisons. Then I arrived at the Morrisons. For viewers unaware, Morrisons is a supermarket chain. It tries to set itself apart, stylizing itself as a high street within a building, though ultimately it is no different from any other supermarket. Coincidentally, the company is headquartered in Bradford, though one wouldn't know it from this one. The divinely sanitary "Welcome to Morrison's Enterprise 5" sign above the entrance certainly made the brand feel like it was being broadcast from another dimension into ours, as all corporate facades do. At the turn of the 20th century, this site had been a quarry. Jowett's purchase of the land marked an admittedly late Victorian industrial transition from extractive to manufacturing industry. Jowett's downfall led to foreign interests taking over the factory, as would happen to so many others in the UK, before finally in the 80s, all manufacturing activity on the site ceased, and transitioned to the consumer service activity present today. On this one site, a story can be told that is in many ways representative of the changing makeup of the UK's economy over the decades. What then has this evolution, this drive towards prioritising and serving the consumer, and presenting them with a wide variety of options they deserve, brought us? As I sat down in the Morrisons restaurant with my front-loaded sandwich, cold sausage roll beladen with far too much enticing glossy pastry and too little sausage, and banana that I could probably have purchased cheaper had I ventured into the actual store, I couldn't help but lean towards the idea that choice is but an illusion, worthless if all the options are watered-down homunculi of a more authentic product, if something truly authentic can even exist under a system that encourages producers of anything, food, furniture, art, or otherwise, to produce not for themselves, but for an audience and a profit, to sell their souls to the grind and produce infinite slop. But the custard slice was actually okay, so it's impossible to tell whether consumer capitalism is good or bad. Nonetheless, the material absence of Jowett and Bradford's many other former industries has, like many other UK cities with similar stories, left a hole. Though I was only there for an afternoon, it felt like I could see attempts being made to fill it with something, anything that might have some kind of cause. On Javelin Close, just across the roundabout, one of the few reminders of Jowett's existence, there was an evangelical church. As multicultural as Bradford is, I wondered how many of the people I saw had voted for reform. I just looked up the two constituencies in the area and did the maths. I guess around 8%, or 2 out of every 25, a little bit less than the national average, though Shipley on its own, it must be said, was much closer to 1 in 10. The Royal British Legion, a more positive cause at least, had a stand set up just in front of the Morrisons' entrance, begging for donations for those screwed over by a ruthless, thoughtless system from those who were similarly at its whim. Jowett once stood here and led the British auto industry's charge into the latter half of the 20th century. Great feats were achieved here. Now there is nothing but vacuous consumerism, the only reminders taking the form of a street name, a police station, and an unmarked photo. Hardly a blue plaque situation. In lieu of something meaningful, even if that is a bog-standard but solid and reliable factory job, and as a result of being subjected to the austerity of neoliberal rent-seeking, people will and have turned to these alternative causes. The road warrior from earlier springs to mind. What drove him to take the path he did? Living in rebellion is not easy. People rarely choose it unless the facade of choice has truly fallen to reveal no other options. People will either band together and try to forge the path the system failed to build, or be sold down another. We must all choose a path to follow, knowingly or not, because the only thing worse than choosing a bad one is choosing nothing at all. Because when we choose no path, we die, degraded to nothing more than a number on a spreadsheet on some information broker's database. I think a result of this is, oddly, Bradford's car culture. Again, I was there for one afternoon, so I can't speak in detail, but in that afternoon I saw more interesting and authentic vehicles than I usually would for a few months during my stint at uni in London. Though I couldn't picture everything, I saw, just driving around on a Thursday afternoon, a Citroën Ami, a 4th-gen Escort, a W20 MR2, 2 Peugeot 205s, and a pristine Morris half-ton van. These are, for want of a better term, shitboxes to most people, and in many cases I'm sure it's probably the only car their respective driver could afford. But they were all cared for, chariots of personal pride, expression, and in their own ways, rejection of the executive level of neglect thrust upon this city. These vehicles saw the nebulous, intangible yet omnipresent and vast eldritch form that our current economic system has become, and stuck up 2 middle fingers soaring into the air. We will keep doing our thing, laughing along the way. No matter how much you want us to become the number on a spreadsheet, you cannot kill us. Maybe I'm romanticizing over something that could have been a fluke coincidence, but something was there, something almost inspiring that I've tried to identify. In this world, the little guys don't win. Jowett didn't, and look what happened. But the world needs little guys, and there's some freedom to being a little guy. If there's 2 things I took away from this, it was to be happy despite it all, and that when someone knocks you down, get back up again. Why'd I end this with 2 Chumbawamba references? They're from Leeds, it doesn't make any sense, fuck's sake.
Look at the world through your Polaroid glasses. Things will look a whole lot better for the working classes. Working classes. I found that essence rare is what I looked for. I knew I'd get what I asked for.
Wait. All right.
Awesome.